All right, welcome everybody to the Gray Zone. Another really special guest today. We have Alfred de Zayas. I'm going to actually ask Alfred to introduce himself with his own bio. But I met Alfred at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. We testified together in a breakout session on the issue of Venezuela, sanctions, and the information war being waged against Venezuela. And Alfred has been one of the top UN experts over the last several years who has really been going against the grain on the issue of international law and calling out its instrumentalization in the service of geopolitical goals by the most powerful and often the most violent countries, whether it's against Venezuela or in the context of the current scenario where you have Russia making a military incursion into Ukraine, being condemned across the world, being condemned at the UN by Guterres, the Secretary General, being condemned by the EU, facing sanctions, being cut off from the SWIFT system. And yet the entire context of this conflict has been left out in US media. Certainly American media consumers are not going to understand the broader context. And so that's why I have invited Alfred de Zayas to speak to you live at the Gray Zone. Hopefully we'll be taking your questions. I think best way to get your questions seen is to make them a super chat. Alfred, welcome to the Gray Zone. Thanks so much for giving your time. I know you just ran over from a class you're teaching there in Geneva. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
First of all, thank you, Max, for inviting me. I remember fondly our panel in room 25 of the Palais des Nations. And for those who don't know me, of course, a lot of people Google me, and I was born in Cuba, and I went to the States as a young man. I grew up in Chicago, went to high school in Chicago, and then went to law school at Harvard, practiced law with Cyrus Vance in New York. He was my first boss at Simpson, Thacher and Bartlett. And I took a leave of absence, got a Fulbright, and went to Germany. Finished my doctorate in history because I had also done history in Harvard at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Never finished the doctorate. I did so at the University of Göttingen in Germany. I taught for a while in Germany, got appointed to the United Nations as the chief drafter for the Human Rights Committee, worked for the UN for 25 years, took early retirement, went back to teaching, taught in Chicago, in Vancouver, in Galway, in Alcalá de Henares, in Spain, here at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And I've been teaching at the Geneva School of Diplomacy now for a while. Now, I was recycled from my very pleasant retirement and made into the first UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. I wrote 14 reports for the General Assembly and for the Human Rights Council, among them on tax havens, on investor-state dispute settlement, on the World Bank, on the International Monetary Fund, on the issue of self-determination, on military expenditures, on disarmament for development, on the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And I have let all of that reporting flow into this book that I published with Clarity Press in Atlanta, Georgia in September last year. So it's been out for about 4.5 months. And it's gotten some very good reviews, and obviously not in the mainstream outlets, at least not yet. I would be pleased to see a review in the American Journal of International Law. And important is that I have here formulated 25 principles of international order, which of course are well anchored in the UN Charter, in resolutions 2131 and 2625 and 3314 and 39 bar 11 and 60 bar 1 of the General Assembly, countless resolutions of the Human Rights Council and of the former Commission on Human Rights. I think it's very user friendly. I think the book has vocation for uh, political science, international relations, international law in US colleges and universities. Already, two professors that I know are using it. But I'm rather pleased with the reception thus far and the fact that the 25 principles have been called, among other things, a Magna Carta for the 21st century by the President of the General Assembly 2018-2019, Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Several high commissioners of human rights have written positively about it. So the book is, if you want, it's a kosher book. It's a good book. I mean, I am not overthrowing international law, quite the contrary. I am being constructive. I have pragmatic recommendations, implementable recommendations. But of course, they don't fit the current geopolitical outlook. They didn't fit under Donald Trump, and they also don't fit under Joe Biden, although there's plenty of people in the United States that agree with me. I correspond regularly with Professor Richard Falk, whom I have enormous respect for. I correspond with Noam Chomsky. I correspond with Stephen Kinzer. I correspond with Dan Kovalik and many others. But of course, we don't get the visibility in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Fox, etc. So most people don't know what we think. And so I am happy that you, Max, are inviting me to Break Zone. I was once invited by Aaron Mate to speak in Pushback, and I have been invited by Amy in Democracy Now. I write regularly for Counterpunch. I've also written for Truth Out, but I don't like to see myself as alternative. I find myself, for heaven's sake, you know, I'm a Harvard graduate. I've been a lawyer on Wall Street. I very much identify with the Constitution of the United States of America and with the good American values, which of course have been corrupted by money, have been corrupted by transnational corporations and the media that has actually betrayed the American public, because the American public is being indoctrinated every day with all sorts of fake news and fake narratives. And most Americans don't speak foreign languages. I mean, I have the advantage that I speak Russian fluently and that I have been frequently in Russia and in Ukraine. I know the situation there firsthand, and I have many friends in both Ukraine and Russia. So I read the information from the source. I don't rely on the filtered news that you get in the New York Times or in the Washington Post. But before
So
you
it's a
ask the
very,
first question, yeah,
it's a very
there's one point.
very
Yeah,
substantial bio, and unfortunately, you get, when you go against the grain, you get caricatured. And I want to, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your book, Building a Just World Order, at Clarity Press. It's a great publishing house. There's a lot of good titles there. They've also published Richard Falk, who you mentioned, and I want to get into that later in the stream. But right now, I wanted you to address several issues around questions of international law, and specifically related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered an address that was widely covered in US media, what you call fake news. I would tend to agree. It was widely covered and completely ignored. At least the details of it were completely ignored. And Putin, in what appeared to be a series of impromptu addresses, discussed the issue of NATO expansion. This is something that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has rejected out of hand, along with the who's who of U.S. diplomats and officials or from the current and previous State Department, figures like Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador, who has been instrumental in conceiving this failed strategy of containing Russia, and now is a major TV pundit here in the U.S. They argued that there was no deal between the George H.W. Bush administration and Mikhail Gorbachev to prevent NATO expansion. That NATO never agreed, or the U.S. never agreed to expand NATO beyond Germany's borders. Start with that and move forward into the various issues that precipitated this conflict. And where does international law come in here if there was no written agreement around NATO expansion?
Well, you don't need a written agreement. When you have a Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, James Baker, negotiating directly with the Russian Foreign Minister, with Gorbachev, with Helmut Kohl, with Hans-Dietrich Genscher, etc. These are people who are plenipotentiaries. And anything that a plenipotentiary says binds. So you don't have to write it in stone. But it's not just a question of a treaty that would contain a clause stating that NATO will not move 1 inch eastwards. It's the perception of law. It's the good faith element that is essential in all international relations. It's not just a question of a piece of paper. When you have something as extraordinary as the unilateral withdrawal of Soviet forces from Central and Eastern Europe, there was a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo was based on a gentleman's agreement, was based on numerous discussions which are laid down in minutes. Now, these minutes are in the National Archives. Several professors have consulted those meetings. And you also know that the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, has written extensively on this. And George Foster Kennan, whom I had the pleasure of knowing, of visiting several times at Princeton, and by the way, who gave me the title of my very first book, Nemesis at Potsdam. I visited him to discuss the Potsdam Conference and
When Kennan, just for context, Kennan helped preside over the creation of what we know of now as the national security state, and authored the famous telegram that provided the basis for the containment strategy against the Soviet Union, but later in his life warned that NATO expansion would lead to disaster and a new Cold War.
Yeah, I wish that were on the first page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That famous article by George F. Kennan in 1997, exactly warning that it is a very, very dangerous game to take NATO to the border with Russia. I mean, Russia doesn't want to be our enemy. Russia did not need to be our enemy. Russia could have kept, or rather the Soviet Union could have kept its troops in Central and Eastern Europe. Gorbachev was, or is, he's still alive. I know him personally. He's invited me to his conference center years ago in Bosco Marengo in Italy. And he wanted glasnost, transparency for the people. He wanted perestroika. He wanted to open up Soviet society to the free market, et cetera, et cetera. And he also wanted good relations with the West. He wanted peace with the West. He wanted to be a friend of the West. And unfortunately, and one day we will know when documents that are still classified are declassified, to what extent American intelligence services played a role in undermining the Soviet Union at the time, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the arrival of this gentleman, Boris Yeltsin, who actually did more damage to Russia than I think any other Russian politician, and who bears an enormous responsibility for the collapse of the Russian economy and of the pensions and the misery that the Russians suffered during the 1990s.
And certainly, we know about the role of the intelligence services of the U.S. in bringing Yeltsin to power, or at least re-electing him.
Well, that's something that is relevant because, as we all know, interference in the internal affairs of other states, and certainly interference by intelligence services, is not allowed. I mean, it's prohibited in international law. It's prohibited in the Helsinki Final Act, in Article 6 of the Helsinki Final Act. Is prohibited in many resolutions of the General Assembly. I mentioned already 2131 and 2625, but there are many others that prohibit this kind of interference in the internal affairs of states. As indeed, I mean, classical example of interference is the coup d'etat against the democratically elected president of Ukraine, 2014, Viktor Yanukovych. I mean, this is really Victoria Nuland's contribution to the catastrophe that we're seeing unfolding today. I mean, it's straight back to Victoria Nuland and to the undermining and destabilization of the government in the Ukraine. Everybody remembers that infamous phone call with American Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, saying essentially who should be minister of this and minister of that. And that actually was a slap on the face of Russia, and a thoroughly needless provocation. Certainly, the expansion of NATO into Eastern European countries like Poland, all the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth, does pose a threat to Russia. It is quite evident that the United States would not tolerate it if Mexico were to enter into a military alliance with China or with Russia. The same as Russia will not tolerate having NATO in Ukraine or in Georgia. This is a red line. And the solution would have been very easy. And if we'd had honest politicians and diplomats, we easily could have made it easy, facilitated a declaration of neutrality by Ukraine. That would have solved the whole problem. I mean, if Ukraine were in its constitution a neutral country, like Austria, like Switzerland, like Costa Rica, like Mongolia. I mean, there's so many countries, and in the history of international law, it has proven very useful for many countries to be neutral, meaning Ukraine could have best relations with its eastern and western partners, which now it can't. I mean, the atmosphere is completely poisoned by this situation. And what saddens me, I think immediately of Wilfred Owen and his anthem for doomed youth. How in with what cynicism NATO has forced Ukraine into an impossible situation, and now we see Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian soldiers and Russian soldiers killing Ukrainian soldiers is absolute madness. I mean, these are brothers. There's no reason to have a war in Ukraine. But in December, Putin put forward two rather moderate, sedate treaty propositions to guarantee a European security architecture that would take into account the interests of all Europeans. That is, I mean, Russia also has a right to its national security. Nobody wants to have missiles across the border. And even during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, you will remember that was a quid pro quo. The Soviets took their missiles away from Cuba, and the United States took its missiles away from Turkey. So here, in the case of Ukraine, there are many possibilities of reaching a compromise that would have been satisfactory to both sides. But I don't think that the West, meaning NATO, has any interest in reaching a compromise. The West has manifested such imperial arrogance, such imperial narcissism, that it shocks my conscience that my country would be doing something not only that silly, but also that criminal. And all that Putin was demanding, and you don't read that in the New York Times, was respect as a president of a sovereign country, to be to have his interest taken into account. And I could have seen many compromise solutions. For instance, uh, Ukraine declares itself neutral, promises not to enter NATO. NATO gives a declaration that it will not invite Ukraine, or for that matter, Georgia, into membership in NATO. And then maybe when the time is ripe, Ukraine could join the European Union, which would be beneficial economically for the Ukrainian people, and everybody would be happy. The Russians would be quiet, they won't feel threatened. But I mean, this threat of the use of force, what else can you describe? The flying in of tons and tons of ammunition and machinery
And now, now Stinger missiles have been authorized to Ukraine, which can down civilian airliners. I assume they'll be used by the uh, fascistic subgroups like the Azov Battalion, which are still in the field around Mariupol and are considered the best fighters. So this is a
well,
pretty
Mariupol, as you
move.
know, is very close to Donetsk, and
Right.
I could see it's a few miles away from the Donbass republics. I think that the Donbass republics could very quickly absorb Mariupol.
Right,
And
right.
I mean, but we don't want more war. We
We had
want,
this issue of MH17, which helped escalate the war and
well,
escalate the new Cold War with Russia. And now anyone in this completely destabilized, chaotic environment can have man pads, the ability to down an airliner. Just one man can just get a Stinger out and do that. We're
well,
going
I
back to
would imagine that Russia is well aware of that, and
yes.
that Russia will do its damnedest to neutralize all of these threats. But instead of trying to de escalate, NATO is actually throwing fuel on the fire.
Well, you've said,
They're totally,
Professor Alfred de Zayas, that NATO requires an enemy, a evildoer, in order to maintain its coherence and its very existence. This is an existential need of NATO, which theoretically should not have existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the talks between Jim Baker and Gorbachev and his foreign ministry.
oh, you're absolutely right, Max. The defensive quality of NATO could have been argued for the duration of the existence of the Warsaw Pact. Once the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, there really was no more reason for NATO to exist. I mean, Russia had essentially declared itself a friend of the West, and there was no more threat from the East. So, what is NATO there for? Except that every bureaucracy wants to continue. There are very few bureaucracies that voluntarily give up their status. And then, in order to exist, they have to redefine themselves as a force of good, to export democracy, to export human rights, etc., which of course is a camouflage for exporting the neoliberal economic system of the West, which not everybody wants. I mean, you have to accept that, and that is recognizing many General Assembly resolutions, including 60 bar 1, paragraph 135, which says very clearly that democracy has many variants. There's no single model. There's no one size fit all. And it's actually in the nature of the United Nations Charter and of the world we live in that every country has the right to find its own way toward a, shall we say, a system that guarantees human dignity. And there will be various degrees of democratic participation. I mean, I have no hesitation in saying that the United States is not a democracy. The United States is an oligarchy. I mean, I'm also,
I
besides
assume
being
that's why, sorry to interrupt, I assume that's why the United States is comfortable with Ukraine being an oligarchy, but calls it a democracy.
yes, well, that's semantics, and that is propaganda, and that is indoctrination and brainwashing. But I am a Swiss citizen since 2017, and I must say our system in Switzerland, whereby the citizen has the power of legislative initiative. I mean, you get 100,000 signatures, and you can put a piece of legislation to vote. And you don't like a piece of legislation, you get 50,000 signatures, and you can challenge. And we have referenda and initiatives every year, several times a year. And we have a feeling in Switzerland that we're being taken seriously, that we count, that we can make a difference. And if it's really important for us, we will go out, we will demonstrate, and we will have a referendum on an issue. I wish that we had referenda in the United States, because if you were to put to the vote, do you want to send tons of ammunition and military equipment to Ukraine? I wonder what the percentage of Americans would be. Of course, I am aware that in view of the daily indoctrination, brainwashing by the New York Times and CNN and Fox, it may very well be that a higher percentage of Americans would approve something like that, because they don't know the alternative. I mean, most Americans do not read foreign languages. I speak 6 languages fluently, and I read the Dutch press. I read the German press. I read the Russian press. I read the Spanish press. I read the Latin American press. Now, um, I make my own synthesis. Alas, I do not read Arabic, and I also don't read Chinese. But they all have English language services. But at least I get their take on issues.
Well, and
And
you also read and write, contribute to alternative media, and that's something more and more Americans are doing. We've also seen the EU and I believe Australia ban RT, and it's related to this desire to deprive citizens of the West and these purported liberal democracies of a counter narrative, especially or a counter hegemonic narrative, because they're looking elsewhere for sources, because CNN is so strongly discredited. Or in this country, there's been this war on a podcaster, Joe Rogan, who's 11
yeah,
times
I
more
know.
popular than CNN.
Yeah.
It's about it's all about propaganda. Even though we don't have referenda like you have in Switzerland, here in the United States, we have very few democratic tools at our disposal as citizens. People are completely alienated by the mainstream. And the point that I and my colleagues, and I know you have been making throughout the entire past week or two about Russia Ukraine, is that this war did not start this week or last week. It really truly started 8 years ago.
Mhm.
And what I want you to do, Professor Alfred de Zayas, is to explain how many deals were broken, first by the Ukrainian US backed opposition to launch a coup against Viktor Yanukovych, and then move forward and explain how the Minsk Accords were essentially abused, never followed. And the whole process that began 8 years ago that led the world to this point where Russian President Vladimir Putin has placed his nuclear arsenal on high alert. Let's go back 8 years and talk about those treaty violations and abuse of
Well,
international law.
as we know, and Victoria Nuland brags
Yeah,
about it, that it
who's
cost
back in the
us
building?
$5 billion, your dollars, my taxpayer dollars, to undermine the Ukrainian government. Of course, through the generosity of the National Endowment for Democracy, by means of financing non-governmental organizations, etc., and also through intelligence, so as to destabilize this government. Now, uh, in February, Yanukovych didn't want to throw the army against his own people. And Yanukovych entered into an agreement co signed by the Poles, the Germans, and the French uh, with Maidan, with the leaders of Maidan. And he was generous enough to say, okay, we should have an orderly transition, and we will advance the elections, etc. We'll see what that brings. And instead of observing an agreement that they had just signed, the leaders of Maidan completed the putsch and had Yanukovych not escaped in a helicopter, he most likely would have been killed. And the same as Muammar Gaddafi was killed in 2011, and all of these so-called color revolutions that are really not homegrown. These color revolutions are paid by Washington and London and etc. It's disgraceful that we are being told that this was a democratic revolution or a revolution for dignity, or it's just simply cheap, vulgar propaganda. Now, the Europeans who had committed themselves to this peace agreement and anticipated elections, when they get violated by the Maidan mob, uh, they immediately, they don't criticize them, they don't condemn the breach of the agreement of 21st February 2014. They immediately recognize these illegitimate, unconstitutional rebels who have overthrown the democratically elected president. There's nothing more undemocratic than a coup d'etat. And there you have the Europeans who claim to be in favor of democracy dealing with those who have overthrown the democratically elected president. Now, if those who took power had at least behaved within certain parameters, but they started showing their teeth, adopting legislation that can only be referred to as Russophobic, legislation and language that was tantamount to hate speech against the Russian speaking population, threatening the Russian speaking population, with a result that, first of all, Crimea decided we feel threatened. We don't recognize these illegal puppets sitting in Kiev. They are not our president. They have no legitimacy. And so we're going to hold a referendum and see what the population wants. And then, indeed, the referendum was held, and they had participation over 80% of the population that went to the polls, and it was over 90% that voted for independence. That was followed by a unilateral declaration of independence by the parliament. Now, I know what I'm talking about. I was the representative of the Secretary General back in 1994 for the parliamentary elections in March 1994, for the presidential elections in the Ukraine in June 1994. I met Kravchuk and Kuchma and all these leaders. I crisscrossed the country, and it was very clear to me that the Ukrainians in the east, meaning in the Donbass, were very Russian, very proud to be Russian, and very oriented toward Moscow. And as far as the Crimea, even more so. In the Crimea, I remember visiting, or rather bringing, making my courtesy visit to the president of the then Autonomous Republic of Crimea to tell him, look, I'm going to be monitoring elections here in Simferopol. I'm going to be monitoring elections in Yalta, and so on and so forth. And the guy looks at me, and since I spoke Russian with him, he says, "Вы знаете, господин de Zayas, не русский." Do you know, Mr. de Zayas, that we're Russians? And I said, yes, of course I know. But of course, that was not my function. I was not there to monitor a referendum on independence. I was there just to monitor the elections in 1994. 20 years later, these words came back to mind, and I remember my reaction at the time, but I understand it since there's no historical or ethnic reason why Crimea should be in Ukraine. It was an administrative decision by Khrushchev in the 1950s when he just transferred it from Russia to Ukraine. Didn't make any difference in the 1950s. It was all the Soviet Union. And every decision was taken in Moscow anyhow, not in Kiev. So as long as Ukraine was not suddenly anti-Russian or even militantly anti-Russian, these, quiet, nice people in the Donbass and in Crimea went along. They stayed. You have your family, you have your links, you have your friends. You're not going to emigrate to Russia. You just stay where you are. And in the case of Donbass, unfortunately, there we did have violence, and the Ukrainian illegitimate government fought them and killed a lot in Slavyansk and in Donetsk and in Luhansk. And then there was this first Minsk agreement of ceasefire. And
This is 2015 now.
No, 2014.
2014.
2015, since Ukraine systematically undermined and violated the first Minsk agreement of 2014, there was another outbreak of violence. And that ended with the second Minsk agreement of February 2015, Article 11 of which is the core. Article 11 does not talk about secession, does not talk about independence for Donetsk and Luhansk. It talks about the obligation of the Ukrainian government, in good faith, to sit down with the authorities of Donbass and to see how they craft a system that would grant them a level of autonomy, shall we say, comparable to the autonomous Republic of Crimea prior to 2014.
Or perhaps similar to the Camp David Accords, providing Palestinians with a level of autonomy in the West Bank, not
exactly.
sovereignty.
That was entirely reasonable. And unfortunately, in 7 years, neither President Poroshenko or Zelensky ever cared to negotiate in good faith with the population of Donetsk and Luhansk.
And so just a quick question, and am I correct that between the first and second incarnations of Minsk, Poroshenko remarked that because the military situation wasn't going as well as expected in the Donbass, the constant authorization of Minsk would give the Ukrainian military time to kind of regroup and create new facts on the ground. I believe.
Well, that's correct. I mean, the idea of creating a fait accompli, well, that's something you can do if you do not have someone like Putin across the border who's not going to tolerate that the Russian speakers in Donbass are massacred or discriminated against or whatever. So there, Poroshenko miscalculated. And the same thing with Zelensky. And Zelensky actually said quite clearly they had no intention of implementing Minsk II because it was too favorable to Russia and too unfavorable to Ukraine. So that having said, you would have expected that the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe would have intervened. You could have expected that the United Nations would have intervened and said, look, the realization of the self-determination of peoples is recognized to be a conflict prevention strategy. We want to have peace in the Donbass. And they're not asking for immediate independence or anything like that. Sit down with them, negotiate, see what you can agree, and we will give you advisory services and technical assistance if necessary. The United Nations actually failed the Ukrainian people. The United Nations failed the people of Donbass. And I mean, the systematic um, violation of the Minsk agreements and the fact that OSDD and the Normandy quartet would not advance with really a concrete solution. That one day, when another whistleblower like Assange or like Snowden comes with documentation, we will find out who were pulling the strings and who were actually making it impossible for Zelensky to implement the agreement. I have a feeling that Zelensky must have been under enormous pressure by NATO and from the United States not to give in.
Well,
And
you look at I mean, yeah, we might not have the concrete details of who was applying the pressure and pulling the strings, but we understand Zelensky is controlled by far more powerful forces. Internally, you have the ultra-nationalist forces who are really the muscle of the Ukrainian military incorporated into the National Guard. They have a national corps that can intimidate people in Kiev. But internationally, the Biden administration was dumping hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of weapons on Ukraine every year and was responsible for its economic well-being, of its aid, all the aid packages which went in through the IMF. I mean, Biden personally took credit for the first IMF aid package in, I believe, February 2015. And where did it go? It went straight out into Swiss banks and, you know, all the bank accounts held by the oligarchs. Ukraine is now the ninth most corrupt country in the world. So it's pretty clear who was making it impossible for any Ukrainian president to implement Minsk if they had wanted to. I mean, we've seen this gradual NATOization of Ukraine, even though it's not formally part of NATO, with thousands of US military trainers in the field, as well as Canadian military trainers and European military trainers.
we're
They're
paying
there.
for it through our tax dollars.
And we're paying for it. I mean, this is your tax dollars at work if you are an American or Canadian or European watching this right now. And at the same time, completely out of the view of off the radar of U.S. mainstream media, people were dying and suffering in the Donbass. 14,000 dead in that fighting. Over 80%, according to the UN, since 2017, have been killed on the Russian-speaking side, the side sort of dismissed as Russian separatists, although they had been Ukrainians by the U.S. media.
Instead of being called, as they should be, people who want nothing else than implementation of Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is self-determination.
Self-determination.
All they're asking. They're asking self-determination and internal self-determination in the form of a new federal arrangement and an autonomous status would have satisfied them. But there was bad faith. And this is a book, by the way, that I recommend to all your readers. John Mearsheimer's The Great Delusion.
And now, Aaron Mate is going to be interviewing Mearsheimer very soon at Pushback. So I think we'll get a good synopsis of that book when my colleague Aaron Mate will interview him.
Mearsheimer, I have enormous admiration and respect for him. He is a very solid scholar, knows what he's talking about. And his analysis of the Ukraine crisis in 2014 is spot on. You can get them in the internet if you do uh, Mersheimer YouTube. There are several of his speeches at various universities that explain the situation better than I've seen anywhere else. But it's quite clear. You have it by Jack Matlock, you have it by George F. Kennan. There are plenty of international relations professors and international law professors who actually recognize who is more guilty in
And
these
in the US, they're known as realists, but then they get demonized as racists because for some reason they might take a realist position on Israel Palestine, as well as John Mearsheimer did.
Well,
And speaking of,
precisely, you know that I managed in my years as rapporteur. I was independent expert from 2012 to 2018. I managed to garner the spectrum of insults, anywhere from Nazi to crypto Nazi to fascist to fucking fascist. Remember that one. To Marxist, to communist, to Leninist, to castrista, to chavista. So extreme right or extreme left, as the critics would like it, on a case by case basis. Because if I don't sing the song they want to hear, I'm a bad person. And since they cannot dispute my facts and they cannot dispute the coherence of my arguments, so they hit me under the belt. They
right.
they engage in ad hominem attacks. Except that the other day I was corresponding with Richard Falk. I mean, what I have endured is nothing in comparison to what Richard Falk.
Right. Well, Falk has been a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week target of the Israel lobby because of his work on Palestine. So he's, walked straight into the artillery. And I actually remember Professor Alfred de Zayas, when my book, The Management of Savagery, came out. I was going to premiere it here in Washington, D.C. at the main political bookstore, Politics and Prose, where I'd premiered 2 previous books. And there was, outrage, and the Syrian regime change lobby was pressuring the bookstore not to host me because my book exposed all the CIA's role in the dirty war in Syria, et cetera. And a number of people complained to the bookstore owner, who mentioned this to me, that I had spoken with you at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and that you yourself were a Nazi. So you were used to suspend my book talk there. This was a literal book burning. The day after it was suspended, people smashed the back windows of the bookstore. I mean, these are the kind of characters we're dealing with. And the censorship is only rising, and it's simply because you have posed a threat to the consensus on international law, which is supposed to be instrumentalized in the service of empire. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, in my view. And what I wanted to ask you, just to stay on this question of international law, is, given the preponderance of violations on the Ukrainian side of the Minsk Accords, I mean, they were never implemented at all, and the suffering of the people in the Donbass region, what rights do the republics of Lugansk and Donetsk have to secede from Ukraine and declare independence under international law? We need to remember that it was the governments of the republics of Lugansk and Donetsk that requested Russian military assistance some 1.5 weeks ago. So what rights do they have, or are there any rights under international law to secede?
Well, certainly. pursuant to Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and the United States, Ukraine, all NATO states are states parties. Now, that is the article that says very clearly all peoples, not some peoples, all peoples have the right to self-determination. Without a doubt, the Russians in Donbass qualify as a people for purposes of Article 1. And then Article 1, Paragraph 3 goes beyond and says all states have the obligation to promote the implementation of the right of self-determination. So it's not only that we cannot throw monkey wrenches into the process of self-determination, but we actually have to promote it. Now, that's very fine and good. That is the theory. The practice is different. If the economic powers have an interest in your getting self-determination, then you will get it. So although that meant the destruction of the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, the moment that Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina unilaterally declared themselves independent, immediately the European countries recognized them. Now, you would have thought that they would have had an interest in stability and maintaining the territorial integrity of the states in Europe. Well, they were not. And take the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which did not occur in a manner consistent with the constitution of the Soviet Union. There again, the Europeans immediately recognized the independence. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have it. I'm just saying that here we have an inconsistency. The Europeans approve the independence of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc., etc. Me too. Me too. I mean, I have no stake in keeping the Soviet Union the way it was or keeping Yugoslavia the way it was. But what should have happened to make this within the rule of law? The United Nations, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, should have organized referenda, monitored the referenda, then we know exactly what people want, and then they could facilitate it so that there's no violence. Violence, of course, we had in 1999 in the case of Yugoslavia, where, as we know, NATO bombarded Serbia for nearly 90 days. And I had to put up with the obscenity of seeing the war blaring from every television screen, which the then Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar put in all corridors of the United Nations Secretariat building in New York. I was there for 1 month in March 1999. I was Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and I was servicing the committee. And I just said, what kind of neutral organization is the United Nations that allows a propaganda outfit like CNN to disseminate this narrative on the war in Yugoslavia? And so going back to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on Kosovo, that was adopted in 2010. As we know, Kosovo, its parliament declared unilateral independence, and then that was challenged by Serbia before the International Court of Justice with a request for an advisory opinion. That is done under the UN Charter, Article 96. As the case may be, The court found, and that's very interesting, in paragraph 80, that the principle of territorial integrity is only for external use. It cannot be used internally. That is, you cannot invoke territorial integrity to frustrate the right of peoples to self-determination. That doesn't mean secession. That means it can be internal self-determination. But the International Court of Justice clearly gave precedence to self-determination over territorial integrity. And all I can say about territorial integrity, it is an important principle of international law for purposes of stability and continuity. But when you have two peoples who cannot live together, who hate each other's guts, the only logical solution is a no fault divorce. Like 1993, Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Nobody had to be killed. You didn't have to have a revolution. You just divorced. And that could have been done if it had been done without all the propaganda and all the hate and all the provocation by NATO in particular. But there are many other examples of force being used against a legitimate claim for self-determination. You have it in Western Sahara when Morocco massacred God knows how many Sahrawis. You have it in Sri Lanka where Colombo massacred maybe 200,000 Tamils. You had it in Biafra, where Nigeria massacred about 2 million Igbos and Ogonis. But in those cases, economic interests, in particular Royal Shell, in the case of Biafra, did not allow the idea that these Biafrans should have autonomy or independence. So the fact that there are major abuses against your rights, I mean, this concept of remedial secession has a certain legitimacy. If remedial secession as a principle were to be applied internationally, well, certainly the Biafrans should have their independence. Certainly the Tamils should have their independence. Certainly the Catalans should have their independence. Certainly the Mapuches of Chile should have their independence. The Rapa Nui of the island of Rapa Nui, the West Papuans, and so on and so forth. But as you know, international law is not self-executing. And self-determination will only succeed if the political constellation will allow it. And in the case of the Donbass basin, I am now actually convinced that there's no other solution but the independence of Donbass. There's no way you can bring them together. I mean, there's been too much blood shed, there's too much hatred, and it just doesn't work. It's like something I discussed 35 years ago. No, actually, no, much less. That was 1995. That was at the time of the Dayton Accords for Bosnia and Herzegovina. I had started my career as a lawyer with Cyrus Vance. And when Cyrus Vance and Lord Howe, who were negotiating for a peace agreement for Bosnia and Herzegovina, I had the opportunity of chatting with Cyrus, he used to come here to Geneva, and we had lunch together several times. In any event, I said, don't try to put them together again. That won't work. I mean, the Serbs hate the Croats. The Croats hate the Bosniaks. It is not a viable union. And the only sensible thing to do with Bosnia and Herzegovina is hold referenda and see whether you can attach the Croatians to Croatia, the Bosniaks to Albania, and the Republika Srpska to Serbia. I mean, ultimately, what you want is not uh, intransigent to say no. We want to do it this way and no other way. What you want is a sustainable, peaceful solution that will not keep the world constantly fighting each other. I mean, a no-fault divorce would have been a solution in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a no-fault divorce should be a solution in Ukraine. But you are fighting against such a monumental amount of lies and false narratives and indoctrination that most people just look at it black and white, NATO good, Russia bad.
Or
Ukraine,
NATO is a defensive alliance. I mean, that
uh,
seems to be the biggest lie.
that is the biggest lie. I mean, I would go one point further. Without passing judgment, I'm just raising an issue. You know, as I know, the London Agreement of the 8th of August, 1945, that established the statute of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Article 6A, crime against peace. Article 6B, war crimes. Article 6C, crimes against humanity. Article 9, criminal organizations. Now, if you look at the crimes committed by NATO countries in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and other places, Somalia, you ask yourself whether Article 9 could apply. And considering that the International Criminal Court, uh, the Statute of Rome, entered into force in 2002, and the Iraq War and most of the atrocities in Afghanistan happened after 2002, you would think that many military and politicians of NATO countries could be indicted by the International Court of Justice, or rather by the International Criminal Court, for the commission of the crime of aggression, that is Article 5 of the Statute of Rome, genocide, Article 6, uh, crimes against humanity, Article 7, and war crimes, Article 8. So I think that the propaganda lie that NATO is a defensive alliance is something that has to be discarded so that we can approach these issues calmly and evaluate the real situation. It is, shall we say, disconcerting that the entire press unisono is applauding Jens Stoltenberg and his speech in Munich at the Security Conference 10 days ago, where he said in a very arrogant tone that Russia says that it doesn't want NATO at its doorstep. Well, I tell you, Russia is not going to get less NATO, is going to get more NATO. And, this is a needless, stupid provocation.
Well, George W. Bush was called a cowboy for this kind of rhetoric. And for some reason, if you say it in a sort of European accented English and you are a social democrat from Scandinavia, you get a free pass, and American media just absolutely eats it up. And we've seen Germany now exceeding its 2% GDP obligation in its budget to defense expenditures, its obligation to NATO. At the same time, Germany is facing the prospect of an energy crisis with the cancellation of Nord Stream 2. So this is the kind of pressure that's put on European countries by their membership in NATO. I quoted yesterday on Twitter the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Philip Breedlove, a U.S. general, stating that membership in NATO means that we ask I'm paraphrasing, we ask the Americans what to do, and we follow the Americans anywhere they want us to go if we are a NATO member state. So this supposed defensive alliance has real consequences for European countries, turning them into sort of military Spartan-like bastions while they're being impoverished through the ramifications of the conflicts they get engaged in.
Instead of arguing disarmament for development, I mean, we have these commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, about which I wrote much when I was rapporteur. And how are you going to finance them? I mean, if we're wasting trillions of dollars in totally useless military budgets and in an arms race and in building more drones and more missiles and more nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines, etc. It is total madness. But of course, the military industrial complex is very happy. They are making huge profits, and they will continue making huge profits from your tax dollars and from my tax dollars. And the level of, shall we say, immorality of this. I mean, it's a question not only of economics, it's a question of ethics. And I just find the entire leadership profoundly unethical. And what they are proposing to, rather than reaching a compromise, they are proposing what I would call a Shylock solution. Now, everybody remembers Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And actually, I have a lot of sympathy for poor Shylock, the moneylender. And Shylock,
well, he was written as a sympathetic character by Shakespeare, yes, who was a victim of anti-Semitism.
He is just so, shall we say, obsessed. And, he wants to have his pound of flesh. And he doesn't realize that it doesn't make any sense, to demand a pound of flesh. And he demands it. And of course, if you're going to take the pound of flesh from Antonio's heart, that means you're going to kill him. So that's attempted murder, etc., etc. It just turns out so bad for poor Shylock. And I mean, do we want that? Do we want to be so intransigent? Do we want to be so stupid that we cannot say, for Christ's sake? I mean, the practice of neutrality in the world, in international relations, is very well known. It's a very useful practice. And I think it's useful for Switzerland to be neutral. It's useful for Austria to be neutral. And it would certainly be useful for Ukraine uh, and Georgia to be neutral. And God knows, I don't think that that will happen. But you know that the parliament in Finland will now have to look at their neutral status because apparently they got 50,000 votes or something like that. So it's going to the parliament on the question of neutrality. I hope that they don't make a decision in this state of mind, which is a rather abnormal state of mind.
Right, right. I mean,
But
this would shatter the consensus, the prevailing consensus in Finland since the war, since the Great War. Uh, this would completely upend Finland's own security architecture.
it
I mean,
would, it would, it would be a huge mistake. But politicians make huge mistakes. I consider that Putin made a huge mistake in actually using force against Ukraine. I think if Putin had maintained the pressure and had consistently demanded a peaceful solution and implementation of the Minsk agreements, etc., sooner or later it would have fallen in his lap. Of course, it may be, and I don't have the facts, that we will find out later. It depends on the uh, number of missiles and warheads and everything that the West has been delivering lately to Ukraine. To what extent the threat posed by all of these additional military machines that have been given to Ukraine, to what extent that raised the level of menace. And as you know, that in itself constitutes a violation of the UN Charter because Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter prohibits not only the use of force as unfortunately Putin has committed, is certainly a violation of the Charter, but it also prohibits the threat of the use of force. And when you are delivering lethal weapons, not defensive weapons, lethal weapons, to Ukraine, well, that is a threat. And I think you would be mad as a Russian not to feel threatened by it. So NATO has systematically violated Article 2, Paragraph 4. And there again, I don't understand why Antonio Guterres didn't offer his good offices to mediate, did not move heaven and earth to prevent this deterioration of the situation, did not give his approval. I mean, imagine that Antonio Guterres had said, I have read the two treaty proposals by Russia with regard to a European security architecture, with regard to measures that should be taken to prevent future wars. And I find them reasonable. If Antonio Guterres had endorsed the Russian proposals, he would have served humanity well. He would have served the United Nations well. He would have served peace well by not pronouncing himself. Also, not pronouncing himself on the right of self-determination of the Russians in Donbass by not offering proactively to go there on a fact-finding mission and organizing a referendum. I mean, it's the inaction of Antonio Guterres that has made the situation even worse. Now, we will see what the General Assembly adopts today, and we will see what the Human Rights Council. We were going to have also a session on Ukraine at the Human Rights Council. I probably will take the floor on behalf of a non-governmental organization that I represent here in Geneva, and I will plead for peace. I will plead for reconciliation. I would plead for rehabilitation of all victims, for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and the Donbass. Not only to Ukraine, no discrimination among victims. That's one of the problems that I've always identified, that there seems to be competition among victims. Like there are some victims that are politically correct and some victims that you can safely ignore. I mean, that is an insult to the whole concept of human dignity and to the concept of human fraternity. As the case may be, I would hope that some intelligent things will be said by some countries. I know there's going to be a lot of rubbish said, both at the Human Rights Council and at the General Assembly. You can't avoid that. But there are intelligent voices here and there. And I would hope that they will convince some of the others. And actually, I have a hope that at some point the Secretary General will say that the 25 principles of international order, which I formulated in building a just world order, are indeed a Magna Carta for the 21st century, as Maria Fernanda Espinosa said, and that it would be used for reconciliation, that it would be used in peace negotiations, that people would agree that basically we're all in this boat together. We only have one planet, and we have 99% in common. Why do we have to kill ourselves over the 1%? And I would be happy if one of the very few presidents that I genuinely admire, Jimmy Carter, would, even at his old age, would make a statement for peace. I mean, Jimmy Carter is a man of peace, and I think that his voice is necessary.
It would be a nice rebuke to the legacy of Brzezinski, who helped.
That is a great pity. I agree with you. I consider Brzezinski one of the bad men of American history. No better, no worse than Henry Kissinger. I think that Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was a very good man. I have great respect for Cyrus, and there were many good people in U.S. government. There still are, but not in the majority. And
well, this Brzezinski mentality has seen a resurgence since Syria. The idea of weakening and bleeding Russia through the use of proxy forces and proxy warfare, weakening geopolitical foes. I mean, it was initially designed to provoke regime change in Damascus, but then there was this fantasy in Washington that if more arms were shipped in across the Turkish border to these jihadist and semi-jihadist forces aligned with Al-Qaeda, that Russia would get drawn in and bled. And now we hear those same delusional fantasies being recycled in and around Ukraine. Months before this conflict erupted into what sort of a full-scale incursion, the CIA was training units of Ukrainian militiamen and extremists at an undisclosed location inside the United States for an insurgency against Russia. And now, we've seen proposals in Congress to do the same, and basically to make Ukraine a destabilized region, much like Syria, so that Russia will have a massive catastrophe on its hands, as it did with Chechnya. What do you think about the possibility of that scenario? I think Russia's security apparatus is clearly prepared for it and learned a lot from the Syrian experience. They did very well after Aleppo, and bringing in peacekeepers and keeping the peace there. But what do you think about the possibility of that scenario, and what about the legality of the U.S. authorizing new arms shipments amid this conflict?
Well, in a civil war, you can support the incumbent. It is allowed. That is for that very reason. It is that Russia's involvement in the civil war in Syria is legal, because he was specifically invited by the Syrian president to assist them in this rebellion. In the case of Ukraine, it's Nato and it's President Zelensky who have a certain legitimacy in being there. The question is not so much a legal question; it's actually a moral question. There is an obligation in Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter to settle all differences by peaceful means. And the Charter itself has many provisions with regard to regional cooperation and peacemaking in the regional context. Well, this seems to go against that. It may not go specifically against the letter of an article of the UN Charter, but it certainly goes against the spirit of the UN Charter, against the spirit of general principles of law, against the commitment of all states members of the United Nations to promote peace and not to throw fuel on the fire. So here it is clear that the United States bears a huge responsibility for having destabilized Ukraine and for having taken it this far. And by sending more weapons into Ukraine, the United States is ensuring that the war will continue. And that is pretty much what we've seen in Syria. If the United States and its allies, France and United Kingdom and Turkey, had not intervened illegally, by the way. I mean, they're all illegally there. If they had not intervened in Turkey, in Syria, the civil war would have ended in 1 year or less. The poor Syrians have been used by the United States and by NATO, what I would say in a rather cynical way, for American and NATO geopolitical interests. I don't think that anybody in Washington has any love or inclination toward the Syrian people per se. I think Syria is just a geopolitical point which the United States wants on its side. The United States has been unsuccessful in its illegal intervention in Syria in trying to impose a color revolution, in trying to impose regime change on Syria. But they continue until one day the United States will have to withdraw shamelessly, as they did in Afghanistan. But in the meantime, tens of thousands of people have been killed, millions have been displaced, and we bear a huge responsibility for the catastrophe in Syria. And if international law were self executing, if international law were actually implemented in good faith, then certainly the United States and France and United Kingdom and Turkey and Israel would have to make huge reparations to the Syrian people. They would have to not only pay reparations, but ensure the reconstruction of the infrastructures of Syria that were destroyed by illegal air attacks from the United States and Israel and Turkey, etc., etc. So take that now over to Ukraine, to the extent that Russians in Donbass are being killed by American weapons or by American missiles or by American bazookas. There's also a responsibility for that. But nothing will happen unless programs like yours and like Aaron Matei's and like the Real News, etc., enlighten the American people so that more and more people are aware that our government is actually committing war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Well, it's going to be increasingly important, I think, given that the U.S. and the EU, which it essentially controls, are formally banning counter-hegemonic media that are backed by government, specifically the Russian government. Let me play this clip by Ursula von Leyen, who is the European, the EU High Commissioner of aristocratic stock, who no one elected whatsoever, lecturing on democracy. I think it's really
narcissist.
Classical narcissist. With the thick and malevolent aroma of aristocracy, narcissism is sort of part of the picture. Now let's hear what she has to say.
European Union steps up once more its support for Ukraine and the sanctions against the aggressor that is Putin's Russia. For the first time ever, the European Union will finance the purchase and delivery of weapons and other equipment to a country that is under attack. This is a watershed moment. We are shutting down the EU airspace for Russians. So let me be very clear. Our airspace will be closed to every Russian plane, and that includes the private jets of oligarchs too. In another unprecedented step, we will ban in the European Union the Kremlin's media machine. The state-owned Russia Today and Sputnik, as well as their subsidiaries, will no longer be able to spread their lies to justify Putin's war and to sow division in our union. We welcome with open arms.
So just wait one moment, Professor, because I want to show everyone something else. I'd just been looking for details on a question I wanted to ask you about. in a moment about the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Belarus. And so I turned to RT, and here's what showed up on my screen. It is, suspicious traffic coming from your network. Using this page, we will be able to determine that you are not the robot. And if I try to show that I am not the robot, meaning maybe I'm not a Russian bot, I don't know what I have to prove here. It takes me to another warning page and refuses to take me to rt.com. So rt.com has basically been shut down, at least on the server in the United States that it uses, as far as I can tell. This is an all-out attack on people having the ability in the West to hear the Russian side of the narrative. And I also find RT to be, of course, it's coming from a obvious perspective. I find it to be more reliable on many international issues than what we hear from CNN, which is sort of, I call it the central neocon narrator or the CIA news network. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. So, I mean, it does highlight the importance of the gray zone or your blog, Professor de Zayas. But I wanted, in light of all of this, to get you to address the legality under the EU Charter. I mean, we have the First Amendment here in the US, which is obviously being skirted through private big tech platforms and the control that the government exerts and the security services exert over them. But the EU Charter, does it allow the EU to ban a network like RT and ban Sputnik? I don't know how they're going to ban them. Will they punish people for watching them? But what is
it reminds you of the Second World War and Hitler banning the BBC and establishing rather serious penalties for trying to listen to foreign senders. But the fact is, obviously, it's totally contrary to the Charter. It's totally contrary to the rule of law. I mean, let's face it. The essence of civilization and the essence of democracy and the essence of human rights in this context is this general principle of law: audiatur et altera pars. You must hear both sides. You cannot make a judicious decision unless you have all the facts. And Article 19 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and all European states, all NATO states are states parties to the ICCPR. I mean, it says very clearly that everyone has the right to seek and impart information of any kind. What does that mean? It's not only the right of the Russian journalist that is being violated when RT is blocked or when Sputnik is blocked. It is my right, it is your right to know what RT wanted to tell me. I mean, I have the right to seek that information. And I would tend to think that all of the readers or the listeners to this program, they should send an urgent appeal to the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, Irene Khan. Irene Khan used to be the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and she's well known for her statement sometime around 2005, 2006, that Guantanamo was the gulag of our time. And she was right. In any event, I'm sure that she will receive petitions and complaints against the European countries that are implementing this censorship. I would think that it is a breakdown in the rule of law in all NATO countries and in all European Union countries that block the news services from Russia, because many citizens in France, in Germany, in Italy have a right to know what the other side is saying, how you're going to negotiate, how you're going to establish some sort of coherent position with regard to Russia if you do not know their perspective. I mean, this top down, arrogant way of approaching information. As a matter of fact, I will agree with you that RT in many, many things is far more reliable than CNN or Fox. And since I speak so many languages, I consult every day CNN and BBC, but also Deutsche Welle, also RT and Sputnik and Telesur and Al Jazeera and CGTN. And I would find it unacceptable if I had no access to this information. I mean, I need it to make my own synthesis, to make my own mind about what is going on. Happily, here in Switzerland, where I live, Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. So obviously, I have access to RT. And it is a disgrace, it's not a word for it, that the European Union, that claims to be have European values. I mean, among those European values is certainly the right of freedom of opinion and expression. Among those fundamental European values is also the right of self-determination, which, if we grant it to Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, we cannot deny it to the Russians of Donbass. That would be discrimination. I mean, they have the same right to self-determination as all other peoples. But I mean, the Europeans apply international law a la carte. Today they apply it this way, tomorrow they apply it differently. And why do they get away with it? Because the corporate media supports them. The corporate media does not call their bluff. The corporate media doesn't say, this is totally incoherent what you're doing. You cannot invoke international law for your friends, but deny it to other peoples who you unilaterally have declared to be your enemies. No, it's not that Putin has been threatening NATO. It's NATO that has been threatening Putin. Putin just wants to be left alone. He just wants to have, like every country in the world, wants to have a degree of security in its own land, doesn't want to be encircled, doesn't want to have missiles in Turkey and missiles in Georgia and missiles in Ukraine and missiles in Finland, etc. It's normal. It would be abnormal if he were not protesting and reacting. And it's not unlike the situation in China. China is also being encircled. It's been certainly an American interest in its presence in Afghanistan and its presence in Asia to threaten China. And I recall many years ago, I had a chat with a senior Chinese diplomat. And I said, look, why don't you just give independence to Tibet? Why don't you just give them at least, a very large measure of autonomy? Because you realize, I mean, Tibet is a stick with which the West has always been hitting you over the head. And it might just be just as well to let Tibet go. And the diplomat looked at me rather benevolently. And then she smiled with this Oriental, Asiatic patience, and shook his head. And then he said, look, we would. But the moment we go out of Tibet, NATO or somebody else comes in and they're going to threaten us. So as long as we're in Tibet, at least we have peace in the area. We don't have to worry about some foreign power putting in its military there against. Because he just said, look, guy, Tibet is not going to remain neutral. It's not going to remain an independent state. It will soon be occupied by somebody else whose interests are hostile.
Well, and we know that the Dalai Lama was evacuated by the CIA, that the entire project of Tibetan separatism is essentially a CIA project. The CIA's old agents who were there and participated in it are very open about that. There's, documentaries of them on YouTube boasting about it. And today the Tibetan separatist movement is supported inside Washington by the National Endowment for Democracy alongside the Uyghur separatist movement.
And we are paying for it.
So we're paying for it. It's our tax dollars at work to send the message to China or Russia, to countries that have historically been engaged in this kind of political siege warfare and encircled by imperial military bases and imperial interests and proxies, that they cannot take one step back, because if they do, these proxy forces and their imperial backers will move in and begin to threaten them, agitate on their frontiers. But I want to bring the discussion closer to home. I just got back to Washington from a trip abroad, and as soon as I came back, there were troops on the streets in Washington. This city has been militarized in a way I haven't seen before since the George Floyd protests, and then January 6th, where there were fences and tens of thousands of National Guard troops around the city for an imaginary threat about like QAnon conspiracists waging insider attacks against the inauguration, just hysteria. And there was very little protest against the militarization of the city. Now it's being militarized again because a convoy of truckers who are protesting, COVID restrictions and mandates is allegedly coming, although my sources tell me that they see it as a trap and they're not coming here. But the National Guard is, there are armored vehicles around the city. An atmosphere of siege and war is here. It really highlights the fact that these supposed liberal democracies see their own people as, or fear their own people. The leadership seems to fear their own people more than they fear Russia. They fear their own people having access to information like RT, because it will discredit them further in their eyes, that they'll turn against these permanent war projects. And we saw in Canada recently the imposition of emergency law because of another trucker protest against COVID restrictions, where Chrystia Freeland who was foreign minister under Justin Trudeau, demonized those protesters as Nazis and fascists. And this is someone who is the granddaughter of a Nazi collaborator who is Ukrainian. And I want to highlight an image that Chrystia Freeland posted proudly on her Twitter account until she deleted it. And we'll see why she deleted it. And she tweeted Slavo Heroim, which is a fascist collaborator slogan, glory to Ukraine, of the OUNB forces that worked hand in glove with Hitler's SS in cleansing ethnic Poles and Jews and Russian speakers from Ukraine. And here she is with an OUNB banner, a banner of the forces of Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera. She's proud of it. And then, of course, it became a political problem for her. But the hypocrisy is really astounding here, to see these open celebrations of Nazi collaborators, while these same liberal forces in Canada and the US are demonizing large segments of their population as Nazis, for basically engaging in protests that threaten their imperatives and their objectives. How much can these liberal forces, which claim to believe in international law, or at least instrumentalize it for their own agendas, their own ends, how can they enforce it or even hold sway at the UN or in other international fora when their own societies have become so destabilized and their own leadership is so widely discredited in the public eyes as this hypocrisy explodes into the open?
Well, in my opinion, the only war that these forces, and for that matter, the only war that NATO has won, is the information war. People have underestimated the implications of George Orwell's 1984. They have established a ministry of truth. And that ministry of truth dictates what facts are and what fake news is and what history is. And they've been very successful at it. So that most people are indoctrinated into believing that we are, by definition, the good guys, and the others are, by definition, the bad guys. And of course, our government is honorable and ethical and is promoting democracy and human rights. And you'll be surprised if you repeat that often enough, people tend to believe it. I mean, I speak sometimes with friends, I Skype with friends in Washington and elsewhere in the States. And I am really surprised that they actually swallow the propaganda, a lot of it. Even if they're very intelligent, they still swallow a lot of the propaganda. I mean, if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post every day, and you do not read an antidote, I mean, you have been brainwashed. And the number of brainwashed people in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, even here in Switzerland, is really worrisome. Years ago, when I came to Switzerland, because I joined the United Nations in 1980, when I was interviewed by Professor Theo van Boven, one of my heroes, who was the then director of the Division of Human Rights. And I remember that we had an enormous plurality of views. I read regularly the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, I read the Tribune de Genève. I read the Journal de Genève, etc. And I could have a spectrum of views which you cannot have today, 2021 in Switzerland. When I read the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and I do every day, I have a feeling that I'm reading CNN or that I'm reading the New York Times. They are aligned with the propaganda machine. Of course, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung has very literary journalists. I like the way they write. It is, a pleasure to read, except that I am aware that they're lying to me. I said I have to complement that information with all the other sources that I have. I still have close friends in the United Nations here in Geneva, and I am fed with all sorts of press releases by my colleagues, the rapporteurs. And by the way, my friend Professor Niels Meltzer, who used to be the rapporteur on torture, he just laid down his mandate, and he too, he's been subjected to such mobbing in the press, including in the Swiss press, to say nothing of the indignities published against him in the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany. It is disgraceful.
For his defense of Julian Assange's rights under international law and his rights under the, I guess, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, his rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I mean, he is a victim of a massive violation of Article 7 and a massive violation of Article 9 of the ICCPR, and the United Kingdom is a state party to this covenant. So his book, which came out with Pieper, which is an excellent German publisher in Munich, that was in April 2021. His book, the original version is, of course, German, called Der Fall Julian Assange, was largely ignored by the press. Actually, I did 2 book reviews of it for 2 separate Swiss newspapers. And the English version, translation, which he did himself, just came out with Verso Press in New York. And I would encourage your viewers to order the book. As the title in English is different, is The Trial of Julian Assange. Now, Niels belongs to those rapporteurs who are independent and who are courageous and to say the things that have to be said. But of course, that brought him death threats, as I got death threats myself. And there are a handful of rapporteurs who are genuinely committed to human rights and human dignity. But whether we like it or not, rapporteurs are also human beings, and there are many among them that are opportunists, many among them that are careerists. And
well, we've interviewed Professor. We've interviewed Alina Duhan as well.
Oh, she's great. She's great.
Outstanding rapporteur on sanctions, who is condemned, went as you did to Venezuela and saw the impact of sanctions. But I also noticed when I was at the UN, this is my first time in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, just to be at the breakout session, you notice the presence of groups like Mossad Watch, UN Watch, which are these sort of NGOs that are there to essentially tilt the balance in favor of, in their case, Israel, but also the West or NATO. And there are all of these outside forces that are effectively lobbyists for.
Of course, they're lobbyists. I would call them gongos. They are government NGOs financed by governments, and they do the bidding of governments. And instead of supporting civil society, and instead of supporting the rapporteurs who are making an honest effort to bring facts to the public, they engage in ad hominem attacks against them. Among them, I mean, I know that John Dugard and Richard Falk and Olivier de Schutter and Virginia Dandan and of course Elena Dohan and Michael Link have all been defamed. And what can you do? I mean, the president of the Human Rights Council does not call this ONG to order, and they still have consultative status in the ECOSOC. I mean, it is a disgrace that an organization that is as destructive as UN Watch is not stripped of its consultative status. Well, there you are. They had tons and tons of money, and they insult and blackmail and whatever, and they twist arms and get away with it.
And just another issue that you brought up, which is how you notice this uniformity in highbrow media that previously hosted a variety or panoply of views. I notice it in the United States, even with the New York Times or the Washington Post or even progressive media. And, you know, there's obviously a factor in Germany. The transatlanticist model has produced more conformity. The sort of Ed Herman model of propaganda comes into effect there as Germany links itself to the United States. I noticed it on my visit to Germany when I was speaking about my coverage of Israel's war on Gaza in 2014, how I was just roundly demonized as an anti-Semite by Gentiles, no less, who never had to have a bris or a bar mitzvah like I did. In all German media, like all.
Look what they say about Noam Chomsky, what they say about Norman Finkelstein. I mean, it's so disgraceful.
Yeah, I mean, it was from Der Spiegel on to like Berliner Morgenpost and the Springer media. They were all calling me an anti-Semite. So it really highlighted the uniformity there. But one other issue is, I think, academia. I noticed a sort of a host on the clown show of MSNBC, Lawrence O'Donnell, attacking Putin because he was not educated in the West. So he didn't go to a top tier Western school. And I thought, well, who did go to a top tier Western school? Juan Guaido. He went to George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. And if you actually go up into the Elliott School, which is their school of diplomacy, it's right across the street from the State Department in Foggy Bottom in Washington. And you'll see like a giant portrait of their favorite alumni, like Kurt Volker, who was the liaison to Ukraine, who helped preside over the shipment of all these Javelin missiles while he was on the board of the McCain. He was the director of the McCain Foundation, which was taking money from Raytheon. So, I mean, those are the people that George Washington University produces by design. I mean, that is the point of academia and diplomatic schools in the United States, at least, as well as, you know, the Harvard Kennedy School, where you have Samantha Power stalking the hallways, or had her until she was, you know, recycled into USAID. What do you notice? You're teaching international relations at the Geneva School of Diplomacy?
That's right.
What role do you think academia plays in the kind of uniform thinking about the international order that prevails in the Western halls of power?
Well, a very negative role. I mean, the narcissism of professors is well known. And professors do what will bring them career development, what will bring them grants from the National Endowment for Democracy and other such foundations that will bring them applause in the mainstream media. And I find intellectually that there has been a significant corruption of the whole concept of academic freedom. So that if you are a professor and you publish things that are politically incorrect, you will be made to pay for that. I mean, either you don't get promoted, or you don't get tenure, or you get fired. And there's a kind of academic terror in the universities. And I wonder if I had stayed in at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, what my fate would have been in Canada. I know that my fate in Germany would have been horrendous because most professors in Germany who have a, shall we say, backbone, who have an ethical approach to research and to teaching, have been subjected to considerable mobbing. I won't give you the name of the professor who invited me to lecture once at the Freie Universität Berlin. And I gave a very lovely lecture, which was very well received by the students. And well, that night they burnt the Mercedes of the professor who had invited me. So you see the intolerance of Antifa. Antifa in Germany is really the successor of the SA and of the SS. And they use the same methods. And I have been threatened by them. And I must say, I don't need that. I mean, if you don't want to listen to my point of view, fine, I won't talk to you. So I haven't accepted invitations from German universities for quite a few years now. I used to lecture, and I have lectured in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Düsseldorf, in Cologne, in Bonn, in Munich, in Tübingen, in Heidelberg, all over. But that was back in the 1980s and 90s when Germany was a different Germany. And today, Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is a totalitarian state. And freedom of opinion and expression does not exist. And if you step out of line, you will be disciplined. And as I said, I don't need it. I only speak if people want to have my opinion. And sometimes, I get accused, why do you write for RT or for Sputnik or for CGTN? And I say, look, I write for anybody who invites me. You invite me, and I write for you. I've written God knows how many op-eds. Even when I was rapporteur, I used to send my op-eds to the New York Times.
Your antagonists want to be able to control your platform. And that means that you write for no one because you self-censor. That's part of this atmosphere of sort of censorship without official censorship. I mean, I think it's part of the Ed Herman propaganda model, where the government doesn't have to enforce a rigid regime of censorship when people are so intimidated or brainwashed into enforcing it themselves. And it works out
that
perfectly.
is something that I wish that the UN rapporteur on freedom of expression would address that in her reports. The fact that freedom of opinion and expression is significantly limited when journalists, professors, researchers are mobbed to such a degree that for their own safety, they decide to exercise self-censorship. That is actually the victory of Big Brother. When it's not, you don't need any more the Ministry of Truth or the governmental measures in Oceania. If you yourself are so intimidated and so destroyed, like Winston and Julia in 1984, that in the end they just become numbers. They keep quiet. They don't speak out. And that is a tragedy for everybody, because that means that we have lost a whole spectrum of views, a whole, shall we say, a whole universe of ideas that is no longer possible to articulate because people are concerned about the consequences, and the consequences can be many. Consequences can be, of course, physical. They can beat you up. Some professors have been beaten up. The consequences can be they destroy your reputation by calling you a Nazi or a communist or a pedophile, or they take you to court and make you defend yourself for what you said, and spend thousands and thousands of dollars in legal fees in defending yourself, and losing all that time, which you could be using for doing sensible research. So the kind of political terror exercised on professors is actually quite effective in preventing any reasonable publishing activity by professors and also by independent researchers. When I started publishing back 45 years ago now, when I published my first book, 1977, Nemesis at Potsdam, with Routledge, and then with the top German legal publisher called CH Beck in Munich. It's a totally different world. I mean, the book was a bestseller, and I got fantastic reviews across the board. There's no way in the world that today I would publish my books in CH Beck or in Ullstein. I published with Ullstein. I published with Hoffmann and Campe. I published also with Kohlhammer. Out of the question. And that's one of the things that I address in the new manuscript that I'm writing also for Clarity Press. That's one of the few publishers in the United States that still publishes me, and
yes, they publish a lot of titles that could not be published. They publish a lot of titles that could not be published elsewhere, including by progressive publishers on Syria, on the pandemic. So it's great that you.
Clarity just published a book by A.B. Abrams on Syria, and it's an excellent book.
This is one of the best books I've read on Syria, actually, by A.B. Abrams, and it's called World War, Syria's and World War, something like that.
Yeah.
But I was able to get a copy.
Clarity gave me a contract for a new manuscript, and I'm about halfway on it. And the title of the new book is The Human Rights Industry. Now, I am not being confrontational or destructive. Quite the contrary, I'm a true believer in the human rights system. And I'm not going to overturn the apple cart. On the other hand, there are too many bad apples. And I think it would be a disservice to the human rights system, which I have served for more than 40 years, if I were not to try to fix it. If I were not try to identify the problems, if I were not to call out the abuses committed sometimes by the Secretariat of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the peddling of false news, the rapporteurs who only toe the line, the non-governmental organizations that apply double standards, that keep silent about horrendous human rights violations while they make a big deal about much less important ones. There is a problem of false priorities in the system, and that applies not only to Secretariat of the United Nations, but also the European Court of Human Rights, of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Service for Human Rights, etc. One of the interesting aspects of the book is actually the true story. I look at the voting record of China, Russia, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, at the General Assembly and at the Human Rights Council when it comes, say, to the right to food, the right to water, the right to international solidarity, the right to development, the prohibition of the use of mercenaries, the right to international, to a just international order. There's so many resolutions adopted by the GA and the Human Rights Council that they usually go through. We have plenty of resolutions condemning the adverse impacts of unilateral coercive measures on the human rights of the targeted populations. But invariably, the European Union votes against the condemnation of sanctions. And invariably, the United States and Canada vote against the condemnation of these unilateral coercive measures. And that is something that people should know. People tend to look up at the United Nations as if it was really the savior, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as being the great defender of human rights. In a sense, many rapporteurs and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights are at the service of the status quo. They're at the service of the oligarchy that governs us. They don't have the courage to condemn egregious violations of human rights by the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom, etc. And they love to condemn Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela, etc., etc. And the other problem is the problem of donations. The donors set the music, and the donors dictate the priorities.
Well, and who is the donor? The donor to Human Rights Watch. I mean,
Well,
Human Rights Watch doesn't really have a constituency base like even Amnesty International does. They have an office in the Empire State Building. They ring the bell on Wall Street, and they have a donor who is a billionaire regime change operative whose name is familiar to everyone watching this, whose priorities are made clear on his Twitter
Georgie
account
boy,
every day. Uncle George. I mean,
Uncle
George
George.
Soros recently essentially called for regime change in China around the Beijing Olympics. He's calling for regime change in Russia. He helped participate in the downfall of the Soviet Union, was called an overt operator of U.S. intelligence by David Ignatius at the Washington Post, someone who, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, after, in the post-Cold War, played the role that the CIA used to play privately in public,
Indeed.
overtly. And this is the guy who is Ken Roth Ken Roth is like the president for life of
I know.
Human
I mean,
Watch.
I
He owed his
wrote
career to him.
I wrote the entry for the John Forsyth Oxford Encyclopedia of Human Rights. I wrote the articles on Simon Wiesenthal, on Ari Nair, on Kenneth Roth. And I know Kenneth, and I also know his salary. And I mean, people should be aware that the Secretary General of Human Rights Watch gets something like $600,000 dollars, and actually, this gives me an opportunity asking your viewers. You can help me with my new book to document more cases of inappropriate priorities, inappropriate agendas by Human Rights Watch and other organizations, including Amnesty International. And the fact that, for instance, when Irene Khan and Kate Gilmore left Amnesty International back 2009, 2010, they got golden parachutes in the level of like 550,000 pounds, 300,000 pounds. If you are a donor to Amnesty International, I don't think you would be very happy to know that your donation is going for a golden parachute.
Yeah, I mean, you have this revolving door between the State Department and Human Rights Watch, where the Obama State Department was filled with Human Rights Watch figures, or Ken Roth's wife, Annie Sparrow, worked with a Saudi-funded medical group that was involved in Al-Qaeda and Syrian armed opposition occupied territory exclusively in Syria. I mean, she was boasting about it. So there are so many agendas there. They're not an independent human rights group.
No, certainly not. Do me a favor, send me everything that you can, because I have that chapter and I want to beef it up. And
Professor, all you have to do is go to thegrayzone.com. On the search bar, write Human Rights Watch, and we have a massive archive. But I wanted to actually, since you brought it up, I want to share a story. I mean, I can't give details publicly. Maybe privately I can tell you, but I actually was in a Middle Eastern city during the Arab Spring, and I wound up at a dinner with several people from the U.S. Who some were academics, activist types, and a figure from Open Societies Foundation was there, who was in charge of basically Soros's Middle Eastern file, had flown in to this country from their base, their main office. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, there are a lot of intransigent unions that won't go along with economic reform, and we want things to open up more. So we're going to sponsor a series of protests and try to move things forward so this country can open up." And that was, someone who has made billions of dollars, exploiting vulnerable economies, was doing in the name of, human rights and democracy and the open society. And, it was disclosed to me
That's a
very
corruption
openly.
of it.
I was just shocked. I was like, this is really, it's real. This isn't some Russian conspiracy theory.
No. I mean, I have seen it with my own eyes for the last 40 or so years. And shall we say, my illusions I've had to give them up one by one. And I still believe in the system because I know great people in the system. I have great admiration for my boss of 16 years, Justice Jacob Muller from Iceland. Brilliant man and integrity in person. Jacob, Bertie Ramcharan, Professor Theo van Boven, the late Idris Yazairi, certainly Richard Falk and John Dugard. There's so many good people in the system.
John Dugard is great. I met him at the Russell Tribunal in 2015, and he brings
amazing, man. Amazing.
Irish experience to the table in international law. I wanted to just thank a few people who've given us super chats. James Kellman, thanks a lot. Kari Mache and Brandon Heaton, thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for a really good, excellent chat. And we've had a huge amount of viewers, Professor de Zayas, who are hanging on your every word. We definitely have to have you back. We're coming up on 2.5 hours now. Thanks to everyone for hitting the like button. If you really enjoyed this masterclass in international law by Professor de Zayas, you can support us at patreon.com/grayzone. If there are any final thoughts you want to leave us with, or should we just promote your book one more time?
You should promote the book and send me material for the new one, The Human Rights Industry. But right now, I mean, you should write to Irene Khan, the rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, and denounce this outrage of taking off RT and Sputnik from all countries in the European Union. We have a right to know. That's one.
Irene Khan, Khan.
Protest to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and demand peace with justice. Pax et justitia. It is important that good voices express themselves and say the Russians have a case, the Ukrainians have a case. Well, let's not use them for our purposes. I think it is obscene for NATO to have driven the Ukrainians into this cul-de-sac, in this impossible situation. I think that the solution of the Ukrainian crisis is quite simple. If you stop sending more weapons into Ukraine and you say, sit together and agree that everyone has a right to national security, stop threatening, stop violating Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, and give peace a chance.
Give peace a chance. That's something we rarely hear. I'm going to have to go back to watching U.S. corporate media after this and hearing reporters and correspondents who had couldn't find Ukraine or certainly Donbass on a map yesterday, referring to Kyiv. They all say Kyiv now. You have to say Kyiv because that's the appropriate way to signal that you support the Ukrainian military within the U.S. media. So at the Gray Zone, we are going to always tell you what they don't want you to know. We are going to report what they refuse to do. We are going to break the media blockade, which is growing tighter and tighter, and the walls are getting higher. But we're just going to keep telling you the truth as we see it, presenting the other side and hosting voices like Alfred de Zayas, who have been suppressed despite all the wisdom, knowledge, and insight and experience that they have to offer. And that means that we'll be hosting more live streams this week. We're firing on, I don't know how many cylinders we have, but we're firing on all of them. So watch this space. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Professor Alfred de Zayas, author of the new book, Building a Just World Order.